Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for our first virtual artist talk of 2024. My name is Hannah Katz. I am the Grant and Education Manager here at Giordane. Giordane is the leading cultural nonprofit organization dedicated to serving emerging and established artists through the collaborative creation of contemporary art using the process of hand papermaking. Based in Brooklyn, our programming includes residencies, fellowships, and workspace opportunities for artists, workshops and educational programming for all ages, and exhibitions and publications. For those interested in hands-on learning opportunities, I encourage you to check out our 2024 lineup of summer workshops, which we've just announced. Scholarship opportunities are due, scholarship applications are due March 22nd, and enrollment starts on March 30th. In this webinar, please use the Q&A function to submit questions throughout the talk, and we'll come back to all of your questions at the end. It's great to submit them throughout the talk because then they're ready for us when we're on to questions. And if you need closed captioning, there's automated closed captions with the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Without further ado, I'm honored to introduce today's guest speaker. Hannah Chalew is an artist, educator, and environmental activist raised and currently working in New Orleans. She received her BA from Brandeis University in 2009 and her MFA from the Cranbrook Academy of Art in 2016. Chalew has exhibited widely around New Orleans and has shown around the country at the Laumeier Sculpture Park, St. Louis, Wave Hill Public Garden and Cultural Center in the Bronx, Minnesota Center for Book Arts in Minneapolis, here at Giordane in New York at our old location, Asheville Museum of Art in Asheville, and other venues. Her work has been featured in American Craft, Hand Papermaking, the New York Times, Bomb, Hyperallergic, Burnaway, the LA Times, the Boston Globe, and more. Her work is held in the collections of the City of New Orleans and the Ogden Museum of Southern Art. She is the 2022 South Arts Southern Prize winner, as well as the South Arts Louisiana State Fellow. So, without any further delay, welcome Hannah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Hannah, for that introduction, and to Giordane for hosting me for this webinar. I took a couple formal papermaking courses with Meg Harris, who's a papermaker in Detroit, but most of my practice is pretty self-taught, which I'm excited to share. So it means a lot to be working with such a venerated institution as Giordane and to be presenting to a papermaking community and really kind of do my papermaking forward presentation. Okay, so I'm gonna share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Ooh. Okay, is it on the first slide, Hannah? We're good? Okay, cool. So I'm gonna kind of frame my talk, how I got into papermaking and how I think about that through the worldview of my practice of thinking about a livable future. And as Hannah said, I grew up and currently live in New Orleans, and a lot of my practice is grounded in that sort of geographical and historical context. So I'm going to open with a lot of maps to give y'all some context, but then I'll get into process and some finished artworks. So I'll start. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is in the southeastern Louisiana, and in this bottom right map, you can kind of see New Orleans as this pink triangle and the sort of classic boot shape of Louisiana as it appears on like the US map. But if you're looking at the map of actual walkable land, this top left map, you can see that actually New Orleans has become a coastal city, and the sort of boot of Louisiana has lost its soul and lost its toe. And for the past, I guess, 7 years, I've made my art practice about exploring like how did we get to this place, and how can I use my artwork to kind of raise exposure to these issues and also think about a different future. So there's a lot of reasons Louisiana has lost so much land, but one of the biggest reasons, and like the thing we're still really entrenched in, is the oil and gas industry. So the top left map shows all of the pipelines and other infrastructure crisscrossing our state. And then this map shows kind of all the offshore infrastructure. Again, this pink triangle is showing New Orleans, where I'm located. And again, if you look at this bottom map, which correlates pretty closely to this map, you can see how all of this oil and gas activity correlates to land loss. And as we all know at this point, the burning of fossil fuels and burning and extraction of fossil fuels is making sea levels higher and warmer. And that's decimated Louisiana's wetlands, which were our natural buffer against hurricanes. And these conditions are also making hurricanes worse. So we're sort of in this unique position in southern Louisiana where we're both, on the bleeding edge of the cause and effects of climate change. And in thinking about how did we get to this place, like how did we sort of allow our natural like we're kind of undermining our natural protections for this really short-sighted consumption of producing oil and gas. Like how did we get here? In 2018, I participated in a festival called Fossil Free Fest, which was really thinking about, in Louisiana, a lot of arts and culture and education is funded by these industries, these extractive industries, and kind of what does it mean to take this funding and how to think outside of this funding. And part of that festival was a toxic tour. And that was the first time I really understood the connection between the legacy of enslavement with our current petrochemical age and sort of the historic legacies for the way we treat our environment now. I think this infographic is pretty helpful. So New Orleans is down here, Baton Rouge is up here, and then this is the Mississippi River. And in the time of enslavement, all of this land had plantations on it. But um, 20, since the petrochemical age, now a lot of this land is petrochemical infrastructure, and sort of thinking about how the white supremacy and capitalism of, that during the time of enslavement, we're just sort of endlessly exploiting people and the landscape to produce profit, has allowed us sort of this through line to the petrochemical age where we're still treating the landscape as such. And I'll show you a couple more maps just to like ground how I'm thinking about these historical legacies and today. And these are pulled from Petrochemical America. And the top map, it's again the stretch of the Mississippi River and showing all of the chemical products that are produced in this region, which like locally is referred to as Cancer Alley for the high rates of illness that people there suffer. And a lot of the populations that are still in this region are sort of the descendants of the first freed people of color. So these sort of same communities are again seen as disposable and like pollutable. And this bottom map shows all of the plastic products that are made in this region. So, showing how this region is not just a sacrifice zone for southern Louisiana, but these plastic products are, they're producing nurdles, which are going all over, and the building blocks of different plastic things. And I think we all know there's really big issues with plastic. So in doing all of this kind of learning and critical thinking about the place I live in the past few years and participating in Fossil Free Fest, I really wanted to think about how how both my practice could become fossil free and also how to make work that would think about this history and this present and also towards the future. And that is how I really got into papermaking. So I learned from Lillian Bell's Papermaking for Plants, which is an awesome resource that in the 1850s in Louisiana, they were making paper from sugarcane. And I started to experiment with using sugarcane as a papermaking material. And sugarcane was one of the staple chattel slavery crops during the time of enslavement and was one of the most dangerous crops for the enslaved people forced to harvest it. And it's still a major crop in Louisiana. So in this top image, you can see in the foreground is sugarcane, and then the background is this Shell refinery. And there's also sugarcane refineries mixed in with these refineries. to the kind of northwest of where I live in Louisiana. And the sugar cane making process, the sugar making process, they grind the sugar cane, and the waste product is called bagasse, which this is a mountain of bagasse at a sugar refinery. And it's basically like a waste product. They do burn some of it for energy, but people use it for mulch. So thinking of that as a renewable resource in my practice, and this is the first time I got some bagasse, and he's just kind of like shoveling me these two Tupperwares, which lasted me a really long time, but they have so much. But thinking about how to incorporate this history and also this present into my practice, the coolest thing for me about papermaking is the sort of alchemical process of taking two different materials or many more, and with water combining them into this amalgamation, to this new sort of like palimpsest material. So I took sugarcane, and then I also took shredded plastic, sugarcane for the historical legacies of enslavement, and then plastic is the harbinger of, the petrochemical age, and a lot of which is produced upriver, and then through paper making, make a paper that can then, tell a story. So I'll share some process. It's taken me a long time to develop like how to work with the sugarcane, but now I get it. There's an urban farm that trucks them in and uses it as mulch. And I ferment it using lye in my studio courtyard, and just kind of like with heat and time, I'm just like stirring it every week, and over a few months it breaks down. Then I'm washing out the lye and getting it back to like a neutral pH, putting it through my Hollander beater. And then this is kind of what the texture looks like once it's been beating for a while. And then this is kind of what my vat looks like. So this is the pulped bagasse, and then I'm sort of collecting plastic waste around my studio as like a microactive ecological citizenship, and also thinking about plastic waste as a renewable resource, as sort of like an art material for me. Shredding the plastic, adding it to the vat, then hogging the vat again, and then this is how I'm pulling the sheets. Show you that. Paper making corn. And my mold and decal is like 12 inches by 12 inches. And then this is sort of how I'm making these large sheets. I'm working with, this is my intern from last year, Hillary Bohm, who's a Tulane University senior majoring in bio and art. And I'm pulling the pieces and she's cooching them. And we're doing like maybe 4 or 5 big sheets on a post, and kind of like with felt, paper, plastic, 4 or 5 times. And then at the very top, I'm putting like a big piece of plywood and a bunch of cinder blocks, and we're waiting that overnight. And then the next day I open it up and kind of like spread it all out. And then this is what the page, like once I've opened it up and they've dried a little bit, I'll sort of hang them up to do the last bit of drawing. And the big sheets end up like 4 feet by 6 feet ish. And this is how you can see how the plastic is really showing up in this really rough textural surface of the paper. And before I got into making my own paper, I was making really delicate, fine drawings. And in order to get the drawings on this paper, I had to really scale up my drawings, and also figure out how to scale up the paper to match my drawings and like interact with the plastic. So it's, the paper making has gone hand in hand with also like how I've been developing this practice. And then this is what a drawing on the paper looks like. And this is about a community in Laplace, Louisiana that is fighting the denka plant, which emits 8 times the level of a known carcinogen, 8 times the allowable level of a known carcinogen. And this community is fighting to shut it down or have the EPA monitor it. So on the top of the image is this oak tree that's growing on the edge of that facility. And then the bottom is the facility, and sort of roots of the oak tree are inextricable from the infrastructure of this facility, thinking about how, inextricable, this is in Louisiana as an oil and gas state. But we are also, just as the tree is embodying this, we are also, this is affecting our bodies, and our communities, and how can we think um, bigger, bigger than this? And then this is a detail shot of the drawing and sort of how the bits of plastic waste are showing up. So like from further away, you're seeing the image of the drawing, but as you get closer, it's kind of breaking apart, and you might recognize a brand in the plastic or a material you use, and kind of thinking about your relationship to this waste. And at the same time as I'm working to make my own paper, I was also inspired to think about making my own ink, trying to be as specific to place as possible. And I also am a Louisiana master naturalist. So this is taken from those educational materials. But I started making my own iron oak gall ink. This is the galls that grow on Louisiana live oaks, and this is the wasp that's making those galls. And I'm collecting those galls and grinding them and combining it with iron, and that's how I'm making the ink. And in this drawing and in the previous drawing, I'm also making the white ink from sheetrock. So thinking about my, ecology as somebody living in a city in a broader way, on biking to my studio, I can easily encounter like a dumpster with sheetrock, and that to me, becomes another renewable resource, a sustainable material in my kind of what's available to me in my attempt to be fossil free. So starting to make my sculptures more, my paper drawings more three-dimensional and coming off the wall, and also thinking about all those pipelines crisscrossing my state and a lot that's not visible. So wanting to make the structure of the drawing also kind of talk about that infrastructure. Um, and these images, you can see how three-dimensional the work is. And also as in the middle of the piece in this one, you can kind of see like just as the wetlands are kind of coming apart, the drawing is coming apart, and you're able to see that infrastructure. And I'm also a bit of a self-taught welder, so it's not like super, it's a little sloppy, but I feel like probably that infrastructure is sloppy, especially as it's getting older. So kind of you're getting to see into the drawing as well. Um, and then in 2020, kind of in the pandemic, I started to really go fully three-dimensional, and wanting to have the sculptures stand alone, and also having, so this sort of newest body or newer body of work I've been thinking about as sculptural drawing. And like really as I develop my own methods of paper making and sculpture, they're kind of like evolving together, which has given me a lot of freedom. And in these pieces, like the artwork itself is becoming these ecosystems, kind of like my imagining of what happens if we don't change course, if we don't kind of hold these industries accountable. Maybe people are no longer here, but I think no doubt the infrastructure will be left behind, and plants plants will probably still be here. So this part of the sculpture, these I'm calling like orbs. Those are also made from sugarcane and combined with lime and paint and shredded plastic, and those become the vessels for the plants. And then this is the paper. So I'm still making paper in big sheets, and then sort of paper macheing, or like on these top elements, I'm sort of welding parts and using methyl cellulose, gluing it on, but also allowing bits to kind of hang. Show you in the next detail shot. So I'm sort of, these are chicken wire forms that I'm paper macheing over. And then these leaves are kind of, I'm cutting the paper and allowing gravity. So there's like blurring the line between 2D and 3D with the paper. And this piece is called Flottante, and this piece is called Tremblance. And these names refer to La Prairie Tremblance, which is the trembling prairie, or a flottante, which was this kind of floating marsh that's endemic to Louisiana. So it's kind of like a moving island. It's not rooted to the ground, so it can rise and fall with fluctuating water levels. And thinking about, um, as we're facing a more watery future, how can we take cues from our landscape and how the environment is already adapting or has adapted. And these sculptures are also pretty like precarious. Again, I'm not the most best welder, but they stand up, but they're meant to be like intentionally looking like maybe they could fall over, and thinking about this sort of place we're at in southern Louisiana on this edge. And this piece again, like these elements are sugarcane, the raw sugar, the bagasse combined with lime and paint to make this sort of mortar that becomes the planter, planted with plants. And then these elements, this is all my plasticane paper that I'm paper macheing or kind of like gluing and cutting. And here's another detail to show you of like the real pipe and then my pipe. And then in this piece, I also had irrigation. So inside of this pipe, there is some irrigation tubing that like when you water this orb, the water goes into this orb, and these are the living plants. And then this is kind of my um, palmettos, my palmetto plants. And this piece, the pipes got like a second use as an irrigation system. So I was actually using the pipes themselves to water the plants in the piece. So the further blurring the lines between like real and fake, and also thinking about, as we are, too slowly, in my opinion, moving away from fossil fuels, like even if we totally shift away, I think all of these refineries and stuff in southern Louisiana, I can't imagine that they're all going to be dismantled, but maybe there's like a second potential life, or like a way that these plants could be, a conduit for water, and also um, thinking about plants as hopeful and sort of offering resilience. Um, and I'll talk a little bit about my ink making, because I feel like it's been developing in relationship with developing my own paper, and in thinking about like what other materials are renewable resources in my ecosystem. Like unfortunately, fossil fuel pollution is a renewable resource at this point. And over the years, I've worked with Mescal LaBeouf, who's on the left of this image, and she leads a group called Inclusive Louisiana, and they fight petrochemical expansion and pollution in the river parishes that are upriver from New Orleans. And she kind of advised me on this project and helped me locate the sites of pollution. So this is a coal export facility. So on the top left, you can see these sort of mountains of coal, which like, this is what it looks like from above. And then this is outside of the facility in their ditch. It's like black with coal runoff. So I collected this mud and then brought it back into my studio and sort of like dried it and ground it down and sifted it to make, what's essentially like a carbon black, but from this pollution. So it sort of has this material history to it. And I created a banner for Mescal's group for Inclusive Louisiana using that ink. And I also use it in my drawings. And over the years, I've been able to get grants to support this project. And with each grant, been able to directly donate to Inclusive Louisiana as like an honorarium for Mescal's participation. And that's been important to me, to raise exposure about these issues in my work and in my talks like I'm doing right now, but also to financially support the work, the important work that's happening in these fence line communities. And then this is how this is the first drawing where I'm using that coal pollution ink alongside the iron oak gall ink. And it's kind of a subtle, like the iron oak gall ink is more of a sepia brown, and then the coal pollution is going to stay this cooler black. And over time, that will kind of also, you'll be able to see that shift more, which is exciting to me. And I could do like a whole hour on inks, but basically this is my palette of inks thus far. So I'm using goldenrod to get yellow, rust and brick to get the sort of reds. That's the sheetrock. Um, Using copper to get this light blue, and then indigo, another staple chattel slavery crop, to get this darker blue. So be able to make greens, and then this is the coal pollution, and then the oak gall ink. So that's kind of like my palette thus far. And then this is the first drawing where I'm using the new greens, and this, learning how to make big drawings out of paper and wanting to think about using gravity. So like the top part of this drawing has a welded structure, but then the bottom just kind of hangs, and really wanted to purposefully kind of use that sagging. And the imagery in this drawing, so this is an oak tree that fell during Hurricane Ida, which was about 3 years ago, and it wasn't a direct hit to Louisiana, to New Orleans, but did a lot of oak trees fell. And then this is LOOP, which stands for Louisiana Offshore Oil Port, which is a kind of strategic oil reserve. And there's all these pipelines that, again, are cutting through the wetlands to get to this like offshore oil reserve that I feel like is mostly being used by, not for the US, but sort of this idea that we can need to continue to stockpile oil, and the damage it's already causing to our wetlands and continuing to kind of like cause to our coast. Felt like an easy play on words of feedback loop, this kind of negative feedback loop in the region. Sort of the infrastructure is dragging down that oak tree, but also was excited to get this like the sagginess at the bottom of the drawing, and thinking about a time, my kids, our descendants, could look back at this and think like, can't even imagine that we were still so entrenched in this, these systems that we already knew were like undermining our future, and kind of like look back on this as a folly, like couldn't even imagine. So that, I hope that this is how it could be viewed in the future. And now I'll show a little bit of like behind the scenes of how I'm making this drawing. So I'm taking a lot of source images. I make collage in Photoshop, and then this I made like a sort of a scale model. It's really small. These bulldog clips, these are like the little guys, like the 1/2 inch ones. So this is pretty small, but I wanted to get a sense of how the paper would kind of like sit on the armature, got that composition. And then I'm making my paper in those big sheets, so I have like plenty of stock to work with. And then when I figure out the composition, I'm collaging the paper kind of into this shape. And I use methyl cellulose to kind of re-glue everything together. And then for these big drawings that I know are going to like roll and go hang and come, like I want to be pretty sturdy, so I glue. This is like a super light but strong Japanese paper, and I'm using wheat paste, painting both sides, and then kind of sandwiching it together, and then like waiting this overnight, and then that is becomes my drawing surface. And then this is kind of the process of drawing. So I'm drawing with the drawing flat, but then I'm also like sculpting it as I'm working, and like pushing it out into space. And there's a part. So then I'm also like welding it while the drawing is still there, which is probably not the best way to do it, but it's been really empowering for me to be able to also do my own welding and like control, be able to control all the elements to kind of alter everything as I'm going, and be really intuitive, and like taking the drawing off the wall and putting it back on the wall as I'm painting, and then sort of cutting it out, and then my assistant helping me cut it. And then this is what it breaks down into, these 3 pieces that can kind of hook together. And then we hang the drawing up so that, when I'm storing the drawing, it can be rolled up, and it also can roll up to ship. And then the armatures also sort of break down. So think about like also, you know, wanting to make this big work, but also wanting this work to be able to travel, and, in an effort to be less fossil fuel intensive, trying to think about how all like that stuff can break apart. Um, Trying to do that more and more. Okay, these are the last projects I'm going to share, and then you can talk of your questions. Bottomland Chimera is my most recent installation, and sort of now really thinking about how to like these ecosystems kind of become with all of this infrastructure. So imagining plants kind of evolving with these things that are left behind, and maybe this is a time after us, you know, when plants are still here, or maybe this is how we're going to experience nature in the future. And all of these, you know, this is my paper, these leaves with the new greens that I've developed. This is also my paper here. You can again see this sort of elephant ear that you know, it's chicken wire with my paper, and then it's like indigo goldenrod copper for the greens and sheetrock. And then these are the pipes that I'm sort of paper macheing in that way. And then these are like a zoom in of the cypress knees. The cypress knees are kind of like swallowing up these pipes. And then this planted aspect, and some more detail shots of how the planters are working. And then this is my paper leaves. This is sort of like, as I'm painting them, I've like welded this armature paper mache the paper onto it, and then sort of like cut this leaf and glued it in there, and then painting it. And this is, I'm using a slab, a molar to make those inks. And this is kind of like the source plant that I'm working from. And that's how I make them. And I think this is the last thing I'll share. This is palmate cultivar, so sort of using the language of grafting, or thinking about like that piece was called Bottomland Chimera, which is like, you know, a bunch of different things sort of mashed together, mutated, and a graft is a more human controlled thing, but maybe this is like something we've created, or like after we're gone, the palmetto is growing out of the pipe, or like evolving with the pipe. And, you know, thinking about, you know, if we don't change course and really think about the way we're living individually and in community, what our descendants might inherit, or like what might outlive us. And also wanting to kind of use beauty in all of these works. And to talk about the paper, obviously I made all this paper and I painted it green, and then I sewed all of these folds. I machine sewed the like palmetto leaves are really cool and really hard to replicate, but I kind of machine sewed these leaves, and then welded this structure and hand sewed it to the structure, so that it like, that's where I ended up. And well, I'll show this one last thing. This is Tangled Bank, which is like the most recent sculpture that I finished. And it's a giant cypress knee that's kind of like swallowing these pipes in the way that trees kind of can swallow fences. And the pipes are moving in and around it. It's kind of like becoming with and mutating with this infrastructure. And here is a detail of it. And yeah, paper making has really been like here for me through this journey, from like making works on paper and really making drawings that lived on the wall, and then helped me evolve into these more like sculptural drawing, 3 dimensions, and also been on this journey to be like more specific with my materials, like in order to live in better relationship with the place I live. And it's also helped me develop a knowledge of place. And I think, you know, the meditative process of paper making allows me to kind of like be in touch with myself. And then through all of these processes, like learning to trying to learn these new techniques and trying to find these plants and working with activists and like being in community with people, conservationists, all different people that are sort of stewarding and understanding, deepening my relationship of the landscape has also become an important part of the work. And also sort of my relationship with more than human kin, like under my understanding of the ecology I'm embedded within and the vibrancy of all these materials has kind of become an important part of my practice, and also helping me kind of model an antidote to like the short-sighted consumptiveness of our culture and moving slower and more intentionally, and also, you know, building relationship with ourselves, each other, and the ecologies we're embedded in. I think that is kind of the way we're going to be able to face this future that we're increasingly, present, especially, in Louisiana, but I think across the country it's showing up. Future is now, and how we can sort of face this future and not just survive, but thrive. And yeah, for me, papermaking has been a really integral part of that journey. So I'm really excited to hear any thoughts or questions or feedback y'all have. Also, so I like touch on different activist groups, but if you're interested in learning more about like any of the groups working in Louisiana or people doing important stuff here, these are like groups that I really believe in and have worked with that you can look up. And then if you want to reach me later or see what I'm doing, all my work's on my website. I'm very active on Instagram, and you can email me too. And yeah, now we can open up for questions.
Thank you. That was so amazing and such a like obviously I knew about your work when we invited you, but it just amazing to learn about it more in depth, especially with the way that your work and the drawings rely so much on illusion. To hear more about the
Mm.
what it's actually made of and what it all means is really I'm like in awe. So as Hannah said, um, we welcome your questions to the Q&A function. We already have some great ones. Thank you so much for putting them in. Um, and maybe we can start with a couple of technical questions. There's some questions about the ink making process, as well as how do you set up your workspace for wet paper making and welding together? Do you physically separate these techniques, or are they coexisting in the same space? So maybe also like, does ink making happen in the same space? I suspect that ink making from scratch is a process a little bit unknown to many people here. So maybe if you can go into a little bit more detail about that as
Starting with the ink making.
well. Yeah, starting with the ink
Okay.
making and then like where does all of this happen in your
Okay.
space?
Um, yeah, the ink making is also like the paper making. It's really process oriented, and a lot of it is time, or like I sort of showed how I'm fermenting the bagasse, and like that's sort of like a micro way that I'm trying to like not use fossil fuels. So rather than cooking it on propane, I'm slowly fermenting it. Um, and the ink, a lot of it is kind of like soaking or sitting, like the iron oak galls. I'm collecting the oak galls and grinding them, using different ways to kind of pulverize them. But then it's also like soaking them for a while, and kind of like the longer you can soak them, the better. And then add iron, and that's the ink. But all the different processes, like for goldenrod, you are making a dye. So I'm like soaking the plant and then doing this process called laking, which is getting the pigment to fall out and then um, saving the pigment. But so a lot of it is kind of like having different things going at once, or like now that I'm developed all of it, I have like my oak gall soaking, but I also have a batch that's done. And like the copper is just like soaking copper in vinegar. And like uh, a great resource I recommend is Make Ink by Jason Logan, which, I mean, can I type in the Q&A? I don't know. I don't know how to add
You can
that.
put it in the chat that everyone can see.
Okay, I'll just say Make Ink by Jason Logan. He's amazing. And that's actually where I learned the copper and the oak gall ink, and a really great resource. I guess I could stop my share. And my studio space is just a warehouse. I'm on the ground floor, which I think is probably pretty important if you're going to make paper. And it's pretty raw, but for me, that works out well. I am welding, like in that video, you can see that I'm welding, like right, right there where I'm drawing, which is probably not the best practice. Also, you know, for like the welding light is probably not the best for the drawings either. Um, this is another, I feel like earlier there's an archival question
Sure, yeah. How are
that
you finding the archival nature of the paper, and how does it exist over time? And are you concerned about that?
I am, the short answer is I'm not so concerned. Like I sort of another, like, you know, I was getting into paper making as like a trying to be fossil free, but also like living in a city below sea level and wanting to make work on paper. I was just like, want to have a material that's not super precious. Like before this work, I was like buying really nice printmaking paper, and that was like this precious paper. Like, so, you know, wanting the paper to also kind of be like made of trash. I mean, I am adding like sizing and calcium carbonate and trying to like do things like that. My like also my technical knowledge of paper making isn't huge, but like anecdotally, like the piece that I made, you know, I have pieces that I made in 2019, which I guess is like 5 years ago at this point, and they're still they're still holding up. I'm not like so concerned with trying to make things that are gonna last a long time. You know, I'm not totally hopeful for a long future. And also, I don't know. My friend who's a conservationist also once said it's like 50% on the artist and 50% on like the institution and the conservationist. So hopefully, you know, whatever institution gets the work can deal with that. But yeah, I'm not like super concerned about it. It's sort of in the whole ethos of my work, and also wanting, you know, to be using materials that are sustainable and they could break
It's really
down.
interesting to see how the limitations you've added to your creative practice, like only using or trying to rely on sustainable and local resources, have actually like expanded your practice so much and led to you learning so many new skills, um, such as paper making and ink making, and then expanding your color palette, seeing that across your work is really it's really interesting to see. Um, on the
Yeah.
subject of optimism, we have a related question from Nicholas Fernandez, long friend of Jidne. I'm interested in how you're exploring the potential optimism or perhaps even romanticism embedded within the work as it envisions this future. Although it appears to be grounded in a cautionary narrative, there's also a sense of tenderness evident within it. I'm curious if you could talk to this sort of authorship and sci-fi component.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I like that characterization. And yeah, I mean, I feel like I talked a little bit about beauty, or like I do want the work to be like beautiful, or to draw you in, and to kind of then you're looking at the work and maybe finding the trash and having this like slower burn, sort of authorship and sci-fi. I definitely think about sci-fi a lot and read a lot of sci-fi, and you know, I'm crazily thinking about this sort of like, I mean, thinking about this talk and thinking about, you know, how paper making is sort of this amalgamation. I was like, oh wow, that's like totally what I'm doing. I mean, paper making is now becoming a part of it, but trying to really blur the lines between materials and kind of imagine what might come next. And um, there's also like this term plastiglomerate that somebody told me when they're referring to my work, but it's actually like this sort of fossil marker of our time, where like plastic is embedded in rocks, which is a thing that already kind of exists. So it's already kind of like foiling with that, and just kind of, yeah, thinking about what happens with our waste. And I am a hopeful person because I also have kids, so I feel like I have to be somewhat, and that also gives me hope. I hope, like, I want my work to be hopeful. I don't know if it like is, but I think that the plants, hopefully there's more of a cautionary tale, but I do think that like the use of plants is also hopeful in its own way, and sort of resilience and what we can learn from plants. And I do a lot of reading and a lot of sci-fi reading, and like maybe my work should be more overtly positive. But also, I mean, I want it to be open, and hopefully people can get different things from it too.
It's interesting, especially in the sculptures, how you talked about the way that it looks like they could tip over. That embodied precarity is also just so beautiful. The way that these heavy forms, especially the earlier ones, seem to float. Um,
Mm.
we have another comment from Anna Benjamin, also a longtime friend of Jinne. I really appreciate your demystification of incorporating new skills into your practice as an artist. The invitation to be sloppy is inspiring. So thank you for that. Um, and then there's another question, another technical one. Can you talk about your mortar mixture you mentioned?
Yeah, this was directly inspired by another artist working in New Orleans. I can type my answer here. I'm just going to reference, her name is Jackie Summel, and her project is Solitary Gardens, which she's another really interesting artist that's working in New Orleans, and she's really thinking about like the plantation to prison pipeline. And she developed this recipe that she calls revolutionary mortar. And so it's a combination. She's using bagasse, which is the sugarcane, and lime and water. And I'm not exactly sure the um, ratios, but sort of it's like kind of like an old fashioned way they made cement, maybe more like. But I sort of learned her technique, and they're like, she builds these really cool garden beds made out of bagasse and lime, and they're the exact size of a solitary confinement cell, and then is working with prisoners, working in correspondence with prisoners in solitary confinement, and they're designing gardens, and then volunteer gardeners are gardening like the visions of these people trapped in solitary. She's like a very much abolitionist, really cool project. But I'm borrowing from that, so I am taking the bagasse and lime and using also recycled paint, and by that I mean like going to Lowe's, and when they have like the mist tints, or there's a recycled building store in New Orleans where they take a bunch of paints that are left over and mix them together, and I'll like buy those colors. Um, so I'm using those colors. That's how like the kind of color is showing up in those sculptures, and the paint is also kind of acting as a binder as well. So it's the like bagasse, lime, paint, water. Sometimes I'll like throw methyl cellulose in, and like some sand. It's like a little bit, yeah, the sloppiness, and sort of I have like a recipe, but it's also, just like the muscle memory of making it. And I'm like, okay, this is um, how thick it needs to be. And then it's like over a chicken wire skin. And then I'm like embedding bigger pieces of plastic waste as I'm building that. Yeah, that's my mortar.
Yes.
Um,
We have another question. Starts with thank you so much. Who are your favorite artists, writers, thinkers? You obviously just referenced an amazing project, so this is very relevant. And then secondly, can you speak a bit more about your role as both an artist and a caretaker?
okay. Favorite artists, writers, thinkers. Um, well, Jackie Summel's great. I look at like Thomas Saraceno's work a lot. He's like an architect that also does some really interesting, like future looking projects, and also like Doris Salcedo for her use of materials. And I really like love May Babcock and also the way she's thinking about all like paper making and ecology. Writers and thinking about that last question or the sci-fi question, a book that really inspired me and what made me want to think about how to like shift my work into more overtly like positive was The Psalm of the Wild Built by Becky Chambers, sort of a, I guess, solar punk. And yeah, that's sort of, I guess, the things I can think of off the top of my head. My role as both an artist and a caretaker. Um, I I like to garden, and as I've learned about, I became a Louisiana master naturalist, so kind of deepening my knowledge of place in that way. And I think just kind of like learning all these processes and how to, you know, access these materials has sort of deepened my knowledge of place. And also, once you are like in tune with all of this stuff, you're wanting to kind of take care of the place better. And like, I'm doing these like in collecting plastic waste, I'm also sort of collecting trash off the street. But I think as you become more in tune with your place, you can't help but become like a better caretaker. And I really do think that's kind of how all this stuff starts. Like, I feel like gardeners and people that are just like in tune with this stuff, even starting really small, builds your awareness and desire to like be a part of making it better. And as an artist, like artists, our job is to make stuff, but like how can we do this in a way that's responsible and not just like adding to, especially if I'm making work about this stuff, like how can I do it in a way that's gonna have like the lightest impact and also hopefully inspire, people to think about how they're making and how they're living and, ripple out from there.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think going back to your list of artists, if anyone wants to learn more about May Babcock, I'm thrilled to share that we have a similar artist talk with her on our YouTube page. So that she's a
Awesome.
great ecological paper maker. We have a couple comments. Someone says that Clyde Connell uses a mixture to make solid mortar for constructive work in a similar way. So that's just a
Yeah, she's
recommendation.
also like another Louisiana artist. I recently came into knowing about her and got to see some of her works. And her work is like, I'm really, really into it.
There's a question, and this might be our last question depending on length, if you can say more about methyl cellulose used as a glue.
Um, yeah, I really like the methyl cellulose. I feel like it's, I get it from like paper making supply places, but it's pretty affordable. You get it dry and then add water and it like lasts a long time and it's not super, it's not made from plastic, it's food grade. Um, and I'm sort of, that's how I'm able to like re-glue the paper back. And it kind of, I mean, my paper is not so like pristine that you might really notice, but I feel like it's pretty good. And then when that's what I'm using to paper mache, like over forms. And just, I mean, kind of like using it like I guess you'd use a paper mache mix. Like I'm just painting the paper on both sides and then it's like sticking to itself. And I think for the backing of the paper, I'm also experimenting with it. Like the wheat paste is like a little bit too strong when I'm backing the paper. So I've been also experimenting with adding methyl cellulose. It's weaker than wheat paste, but for the my constructions, it's strong enough.
I'm so interested that by the range of work that, including paper mache work that you call drawings. I think that's really interesting.
Thank you.
Um, so I think that we might have time for one more question if someone wants to type them in, or Hannah, if you have any remaining thoughts on or like
I
things that
think
have
it's funny
been
that Brooke.
stirred up.
Well, I like it's funny that Brooke meant like as a parent, because that is true. Also, I had a baby about 12 weeks ago, so this is kind of my first artist talk back in the mix, which has been, thank you guys for being so I don't know, understanding of my brain's still kind of like mushy. But yeah, I definitely like parenting as an artist and thinking about all this stuff is, I don't know, I think it makes me more, interested in like finding solutions, and also excited to bring my daughter. My older kid is 3, so like she has her own like studio in our house and is more interested in what I'm making and like has a lot more questions, which is like super interesting and kind of keeps me nimble to try and like think about my work through her lens.
Um, so there's a congratulations, which I'm sure is echoed by everyone. There's a not a question, but a huge thank you to Hannah Chalew and Judene for this wonderful talk, which thank you for coming, sharing this time with us. And we have another comment that the trees absorbing the pipes is very helpful. It's about adapting, which I think is what we have to do to survive, which is really lovely
Yeah, thank
response.
you.
Yeah, so it's just about 2 p.m. So I think that we can end on time. Thank you all so much for joining us. A huge thank you to Hannah for sharing her gorgeous work with us and more about her process and behind the scenes. Um, and we really appreciate that you all joined us and shared thoughtful questions. Take care,
Yeah,
everyone.
thanks so much. Bye everyone.